Hello and welcome back to another episode of the GTM Playbook podcast. Today I'm joined by Varun Bhandarkar, the man behind Stripe's SMB and mid-market GTM strategy right across Asia. For those following Stripe's journey, it is now the world's leading financial infrastructure platform, powering payments, billing, and money movement for companies globally. Last year, Stripe processed over $1.9 trillion in payment transactions and is now valued at around $159 billion, making it one of the highest valued private companies in the world alongside SpaceX and OpenAI. Before Stripe, Varun spent over 6 years at HubSpot, one of the world's leading CRM and marketing software platforms. In today's conversation, we'll extract how Varun approaches GTM within these tech giants, including how he prioritizes, how he designs plays, and how he builds compounding growth, and a number of strategies that other GTM leaders can learn and adopt immediately. Varun, thanks so much for being here and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, mate. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Now, I'd love to start with your inspiring career journey, starting as an immigrant to Australia, struggling to land your first job, to finding yourself at HubSpot and now leading GTM across Asia at one of the biggest private companies in the world. If you can walk us through that journey, what was it like and some of the key learnings you had along the way?
Yeah, thanks for that, Mark. And look, hopefully inspiring. Look, it definitely inspired me along the way in terms of just being able to understand, what's really capable when you just, put in the hard yards. But I think about it this way, life works in really mysterious ways because where I've landed today is probably not where I originally imagined myself to be. I grew up in Muscat, Oman in the Middle East and moved to India in 2005 to do my undergrad. My post-undergrad career actually started in client services teams in advertising agencies in Saatchi and Saatchi. And this was in 2008. So if anyone remembers 2008, it was bang smack in the middle of the global financial crisis. Fun times. I then moved to Australia in 2010 to pursue my master's. And as I said, I originally wanted to pursue a career in digital marketing. I even managed to get an internship with the digital marketing team at the Sydney Opera House. However, at that point in time in Australia, the visa rules and regulations meant that I either had to get sponsored or I had to get, have either residency or some sort of work rights that allowed me to get some of these jobs. So getting a marketing job was proving quite difficult as I didn't have that breadth of experience or the working rights that the businesses are looking for. So I took a step back and then widened the criteria of jobs that I was looking for and started looking at digital native businesses, hoping that a business would take a chance on potential over experience and more importantly, be willing to sponsor a visa for me to stay back and work. So what I was doing was once I finished uni, I had around 2.5 months left on my student visa. And I spent every single work day doing a part-time job in a mailroom of a company called Converger. And in the evenings, I would go back and basically rewrite my CV and cover letter to apply for at least 5 jobs. I wanted to make sure that when somebody did see it, that the resume spoke to the job that I'd applied for and it was very, very customized. I really, really wish I had access to AI then, it would have made my job so much easier. And one of those jobs happened to be this job, BDR job at Meltwater, a digital and social media software company. I applied and I also took a punt and tweeted them immediately, hoping to get noticed. I've shared the screenshot with you, but it was funny, right? Because I hadn't thought about this for a really long time and I had to really go, log into Twitter again because I'm not that active on Twitter and get the screenshot for you. Hashtag dreamer, hashtag driven, a couple of typos, but I think this kind of just goes back to showing how excited I was and maybe how nervous I was as well as I did that. And it did actually get me noticed. I organized my first, coffee chat over a Twitter message exchange with the hiring manager 3 weeks later. That was my first tech job where I familiarized myself with the cold, hard world of prospecting and more importantly, rejection. Lots and lots and lots of rejection. Luckily, I managed to find a way to survive and eventually thrive at Meltwater with the support and coaching of my managers and mentors growing into 2 other roles. I'd say that Meltwater is where I really cut my teeth in sales and even managed to, find my way to the Meltwater $1 Million Club. 2 years later, an ex-colleague reached out to me with an opportunity at HubSpot. World-class product underpinned by a category-defining marketing and selling methodology. And more importantly for me at that point in time, it was a company and its founders whom, as an aspiring marketer, I really idolized. Like I still idolize Brian Halligan and Dharmesh Shah, who are like, some pioneers of what it means to build a world-class sales-led growth company. So when that happened, I had to make the move. Like how was I not going to join the company that had essentially coined the terminology inbound marketing? I spent 6+ years there, mostly in the channel sales team before taking the reins as the leader of the customer success team for Australia and New Zealand. And I'd say like HubSpot is where I really grew up, both as a person, as a professional, and as a leader. And I don't say that lightly. The single most thing that HubSpot instilled in me was what it means to be truly customers first, not as a value on the wall or not something you just say that, say out loud to get, clicks, but just how you run the product and how every single interaction at every single layer of the company could be oriented around that particular value. So, like I said, I really saw this how in how the product was built, how marketing talked about customers, how sales approached conversations as well, and how customers' success was treating every single interaction. And that philosophy has shaped how I think about go to market. Because when you're truly customer first, you stop thinking about how we hit the number and we focus more on what does the customer really care about and how do we make them really successful. And in my experience, and this has never failed me, thinking about that second question is what always leads to the first. Beyond professional growth, what I really loved about HubSpot was it gave me something like invaluable and introduced me to people who pushed me and challenged me and believed in me. And a lot of them are still some of my closest mates and mentors to this day. And I'll always forever, ever be grateful for my time there. And then in 2021, late, 2021, I joined Stripe to lead the existing business sales team. I was hired then with the purpose of building and transforming a reactive commercial team into a strategic growth engine. And the last 4 years at Stripe is where I'd say my learning as a go-to-market leader has been like exponential. Not just because of the business transformation challenge, but because I was given the autonomy to experiment, fail fast, and execute at scale. And I had to do all of this while the product and the company was evolving at breakneck speed. New products, new markets, the competitive landscape was shifting constantly. And I had to learn what it meant to build the rocket ship as we flew. Operating across different countries also gave me a depth of understanding across cultural nuance that you simply cannot get from a textbook. Right? Like, going into Japan, you have to go into a meeting with business cards, for example, right? Like who uses business cards in Australia these days? But I'd say one of the greatest privileges of this role has been getting a front row seat into business models and ambitions of some truly incredible founders across the region like yourself. And I think you and I, in the biggest scheme of things, are connected through the Stripe network as well. Founders who are building category defining companies, thinking about scale in ways that most people don't dare to. And that's what's truly remarkable, right? And that exposure has fundamentally shaped how I now think about what's possible. And bringing it back closer home, being a founder-led business ourselves, I've also seen firsthand what is possible when you elevate the ambition bar for genuinely intelligent and driven people and give them the resources, the space, and the trust to execute. It gave me like a front row seat into understanding what happens when the best financial infrastructure company is aligned with the best people, what sort of scale is attainable both on the go-to-market as well as the product side. And earlier this year, I've taken on the new role of leading the go-to-market efforts for startups, SMB, and mid-market across Southeast Asia, which in a way brings everything full circle in a way that I didn't see coming when I was in the mail room, kind of lodging all of those mails, thinking about how many jobs I was going to apply for that evening.
Yeah, wow. What an inspiring story. And I think for a lot of listeners, who might be on that pathway somewhere, there's a lot of people who may be an immigrant to a new country trying to get started. There'll be people in individual contributor roles right now, with dreams to one day move into a leadership role and potentially work for some of the leading tech companies. I think, having heard that from yourself, seeing someone who's been through that journey, it's truly inspiring. So thanks for sharing that. Throughout that journey, you've gone through these different roles. You've been an individual contributor. You've moved into leadership now. Would you say there was a big inflection point at some part along that journey where you felt you truly had to level up as a leader that allowed you to transition from an individual contributor into a leadership role?
Yeah. I really love how this question is framed. I would say that I've had multiple inflection points throughout my career. Even in leadership, I've had like multiple inflection points. Just thinking back on 12 months, I've probably had at least one. But going back to your question, I think there's a big difference between leveling up as an operator and leveling up as a leader. So for me, the biggest inflection point was my first year as a people leader at HubSpot back in 2019. And the honest version of the story is that going into that role, I was genuinely naive. I had been a high performing individual contributor. I knew what worked and I knew that really well. Right? I had a playbook. And I walked into the leadership role thinking that my job was essentially to hand that playbook to my team and ask them to replicate what I'd done. I was completely wrong. What I didn't understand then and what I've had to learn the hard way is that what works for you as an individual almost never translates directly to other people. People are motivated differently, they learn differently, they process feedback differently, they have different strengths and different gaps. And more importantly, they all have different journeys that kind of brings them to where they are today. So rather than trying to clone myself and developing them for who they are, that was like my fundamental leadership error. And by the middle of the year, it was becoming quite obvious that, we were not going to hit our number. And this is for the first time in my career that I was staring down a miss, not just personally, but in the first year that the business trusted me as a leader to deliver. And that hit differently because it wasn't just a performance outcome. It was almost becoming a reflection of who I was. I had to do a lot of self-reflections in that period. I leaned, really heavily on my mentors, both in and outside of work in a way that I'd never done before, right? Like I had to be really, really vulnerable, tell them about what exactly was going on. So that way I could hopefully get something from them that would pull me out of this situation. And what came out of those conversations was fundamentally how I shifted how I think about leadership. I stopped asking, how do I get my team to do what I do? And started asking a little bit more about how do I create the conditions for each person on this team to be the best version of themselves? That's a completely different job. And honestly, that's much more interesting, but also significantly harder. So thinking back, I'd say like, missing my number in 2019, it really hurt. But it was also the catalyst for something really important because that miss gave me the opportunity to rebuild the team. And this time I was much more intentional about who I brought in. I stopped purely hiring for experience and started hiring for motivation and resilience, people who were hungry, who could take a hit and come back with a clear head, who genuinely wanted to grow. And that shifting my hiring philosophy kind of changed everything. In 2020, going into 2020, we were resilient enough to navigate, COVID-19 and actually even end up being like the best performing CS team at HubSpot. So I'd probably say like that was one of my biggest inflection points.
What an interesting mindset shift. And you mentioned there about creating the conditions for each person in your team to be the best versions of themselves. Are you able to share just some ways that you help create the conditions for them to be the best versions of themselves?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think the first and the most important thing to do is working towards creating a psychologically safe environment for people. And what that allows is for people to bring just like, their true selves to work. So what I really had to do was create an environment where we, not just me and them, like not just individually, but the team collectively knew who we were. Like who this person was outside of their job, what's their backstory, similar to what I've just shared with you. What's their backstory? What do we care about? What kind of really motivates them? I'd say like creating that environment allowed for us to just be a cohesive unit. And more importantly, what I didn't try and do was I didn't ask everybody to do the same thing. One person had like, let's say, for example, one person's strength was one particular product or one particular strategy. What I would do is I'd give them the spotlight and say, hey, can you kind of be the DRI to help elevate the entire team on this particular thing? So rather than leaning on, trying to get everybody to the same level of expertise across the board, what I did was I got somebody who had developed that deep expertise in one particular area to take the reins on it and take ownership of it and help elevate the rest of the team. So that way, then the onus of doing that didn't necessarily sit entirely with me either.
So interesting. One of the best pieces of advice I've ever received was around understanding or acknowledging that everyone has strengths and weaknesses. And I think as leaders, we can often spend too much time trying to train someone on their weaknesses. And it can be a never ending battle because you're just constantly, picking them up on their flaws. And for that individual, it's quite demeaning. And It's when you make that shift to go, identify their strengths and get them to double down on those areas of strength, and then surround them with people to mitigate them, as opposed to trying to get them to, because normally their strengths, like the strength becomes also a weakness. And so if you try and switch their focus, then their strength all of a sudden diminishes as well. And now with AI tools, it's even easier because you don't necessarily have to surround them with people. You could surround them with AI agents to help support them as well.
You're spot on, right? And I think that is something that a lot of new leaders and managers make as well, is they really tend to double down on identifying areas of improvement or, weakness, and they try and index on that versus getting people to really hone their strengths and, finally craft that strength to become a superpower.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, HubSpot to Stripe is quite a big jump from a CRM software platform to a financial infrastructure platform. What are some of the things that you had to learn and potentially unlearn when transitioning between those two different industries?
Yeah, for sure. Look, I think the honest answer here is, because I was thinking about this, I think there were three distinct things of kind of learning and a little bit of unlearning, and one mindset that I had to really double down on. Uh, First is the domain knowledge. Started on level 0 on payments. Like I did not have any payments related experience. So everything like payment rails, card networks, scheme fees, payment flows, authorization rates. Coming from a CRM background, none of this was in my vocabulary. And I'll be super transparent that given how dynamically the space is evolving, I'm still learning new things about this landscape to this day. Payments is genuinely one of the most complex and fascinating industries that I've ever encountered, which is why you can see people make a career out of this, because there's always something new that happens, especially now with the advent of stable coins, etc. Like how payments is happening around the world is fundamentally shifting. Second is I had to unlearn about what I thought about go-to-market motions. As I said, HubSpot is a sales-led growth company. Stripe is product-led. And what I quickly realized is that, these aren't contrasting models, they're complementary. In fact, a large part of my team's role when I joined was working with startups and SMBs who had come in via the self-serve channel, but had grown to a point of complexity and now wanted a strategic conversation with a salesperson. So the product had already done the work of acquiring them and laying the foundations. My team's job was to help them grow. Third, and this one really challenged my mental models, was the shift from SaaS contracts into consumption-based contracting. Because in SaaS, you sign a contract and you know what to anticipate in terms of your revenue run rate for the duration of that contract. However, in consumption model, a signed contract can mean $0 on day one. But with the right customer, the true revenue potential could be 10 times what you signed them for. And that completely changes how you think about your ideal customer profile, deal quality, and long-term value. Now, all of this did mean at that point in time, I was battling some serious imposter syndrome. I had a relatively young team of 4, but they'd been at Stripe for longer than me. And they did have that technical and payments knowledge that I did not. So I was the noob on the team. But I made a deliberate decision that while I was plugging my knowledge gaps, I was going to be the most observant, curious person in every single interaction and meeting. So I asked a lot of questions of peers, both internal and external, listening a lot more than I spoke. And I do think that curiosity is ultimately what accelerated my learning faster than anything else.
Absolutely. And sometimes that new perspective as well. Sometimes people who are too familiar with the way things have always been done can get caught in a trap of, this is how it's always been done, and continue and never really think outside the box. Whereas sometimes those fresh eyes, new perspectives can sometimes change things and can create growth as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And now that I've been here for a little over 4 years and I've just hired a new manager to look after Singapore and Malaysia, he's bringing that perspective to the team. Like he's ex-Google, but he's coming in and asking a couple of questions about, hey, why are we doing things this way? And I love that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, you've just been promoted to a bigger remit, owning the entire P&L for Stripe's go-to-market across Southeast Asia, as you mentioned. How do you approach stepping into a new GTM leadership role? If you can just walk us through, say your first 90 days, what did you do first? What did you audit? And what have been some of those early decisions to help set the direction of your team over the next 12 months?
Yeah. I'm actually like really thankful for this opportunity that I've gotten at Stripe because it takes me back for, 4.5 years when I joined. I'm once again responsible for a region I'm familiar with, but not an expert in. And I'm also leading a team that I'm familiar with, but I've never worked directly before. So it's largely new to me. So in many ways, I'm back at the beginning, just with a lot more gray hair or experience, as people like to call it. Now, I will caveat this, by saying this, right? What's true today may not be true tomorrow. We're living in a time of real change, both exciting and quite nerve-wracking. And all of that comes with real uncertainty. So whilst I have a 2026 strategy, I've made it both clear to the team as well as the business that if the market and the data is telling us that we need to do something differently, we will pivot hard if we have to. And in my mind, that's quite imperative in a fast-moving environment. Going back to your question, my original plan, while I was building my 2026 plan, I focused on three core things: the team, the data, and the cross-functional stakeholders. The team came first. Before I formed my opinions or made any decisions, I spoke to the team to understand what was working, what wasn't, and most importantly, what we needed to do to succeed. The people closest to the customer, the people closest to the ground have the best signal. And frankly, if you start a new leadership role by telling people what to do, before you listen to what they know, you're already behind. So, taking back to my learning from 2019. Then I got into the data, and the context here is extremely important. So for anyone who wants a full picture of the environment that I'm operating in, I will plug in, that they read or listen to Stripe's 2025 annual letter. So our founders, Patrick and John Collison, publish it every year, and it's one of the best pieces of writing on the state of the internet economy. It's publicly available and really worth your time. And I will be calling on some of the data from that annual letter as I kind of respond to some of this. So relevant extract from it, Stripe processed $1.9 trillion in payment volume in the last year, which is up by 34%. The new cohort of businesses starting on Stripe in 2025 is the fastest moving we've seen, growing at around 50% faster than 2024. So, and like more than half of that cohort is based outside of the US. That's the kind of tailwind that I'm operating in. A lot of founders I work with across Asia are building for the world from day one. So effectively capturing that cross-border revenue is a default strategy and not just a plan. That fundamentally changes how I need to think about my go-to-market motion, because we're not just helping businesses figure out how to eventually go global. We're also helping them, businesses who are already global, figure out how to do it better and how to do it faster. Those are very different conversations. So when I zoomed out to understand my headwinds and tailwinds, I wasn't just looking at internal metrics. I was looking at what the market was telling us in terms of where we had momentum and where friction, still existed. Finally, the cross-functional stakeholders. I identified the three cross-functional stakeholders that we needed to align with and leverage to add real force to our flywheel. In a company moving as fast as Stripe, the teams that consistently win, in my opinion, are the ones who know how to mobilize the broader organization behind them. And, to kind of distill it, if I was to just make some recommendations for people who are stepping into a new leadership role, moving into the future, I'd say the first thing to do is, definitely listen to your people, try and understand from them what is working, what isn't working, and why. Then get stuck into the data, look for trends and anomalies, where you're winning consistently and why. And third, I didn't talk about this because, it's just how I operate and I've always operated. But if you aren't already, speak to your customers, get on customer calls. I'll say that's absolutely non-negotiable, because getting the customer's perspective firsthand is what will give you the real one understanding of what you need to do. I've seen a lot of leaders, extremely impressive on paper, fail in roles that they took on because they took like an inside out approach that never landed with the market. A customer will tell you something that no amounts of internal data or report will.
Yeah, that's such an interesting advice there. And yeah, I see it time and time again where, a leadership level will kind of hide behind their people and go, hey, go get me this. And sometimes there's value in just, jumping on the front line with your troops and getting the insights yourself.
Yeah, 100%.
And you're running go-to-market across very different Asian markets right now, different countries within that region. And, for folks who haven't had experience working across the Asian markets can sometimes categorize it as that's Asia, they all operate the same. But my assumption is that's probably not the case. So how do you approach each market and what kind of differences do you see within the Asian region?
Yeah, Look, what makes working across Asia so fun is also what makes it really challenging. Every country is distinct in language, culture, buyer behavior, and payment preference. And all of that compounds significantly, when we're drilling into payments specifically, right? Let's just take three markets as examples. Singapore is highly developed, English-speaking financial hub with really sophisticated buyers, shorter sales cycles, and a high appetite for digital-first solutions. It really punches well above its little weight as, a tiny island that is 40 odd kilometers end to end, as a launchpad for regional expansion. Thailand, on the other hand, has a completely different identity. It's got a strong preference for local payment methods such as Pompey, a business culture that values hierarchy and formality, and a buyer who genuinely wants to feel consulted than sold to. Vietnam, on the other hand, is one of the most exciting growth markets in the region with a very young entrepreneurial population and a rapidly digitalizing economy. But navigating the regulatory complexity and building local credibility there takes real investment and patience. And that's something that, I'm personally figuring out this year too. And then the cross-border nature of our users makes things even more interesting. The Stripe annual letter highlights this, that amongst businesses with mostly international revenue, 30% of that revenue comes from countries that are neither their home market nor in the top 10 of the global economies. And when you look at it from the Asian lens, our Asian businesses and founders are at the forefront of that trend. So the bottom line is that, you cannot hire thousands of people to address every nuance. If you can, I'm jealous of you and, good for you, but you can't, right? So you need a structure that is consistent at the core, but gives people on the ground real room to adapt. And I'd say like my job as a leader is to remove the friction at that point in time and is to not really dictate that to the team.
And do you find different channels and messaging work better for different markets? And do you have to, I guess, approach different channels, whether you're marketing to Thailand versus, say, Singapore?
Yeah. So let me just kind of elaborate on what I was saying, right? So maybe I'll talk a little bit more about, what from Stripe's perspective we've standardized and, what we're localizing, in terms of the actual approach to the markets. So the standardization code that I referred to are the things that create like a shared language that allow us to scale consistently. So at Stripe, we use the MEDIC framework, which is, which really ensures that all frontline go-to-market resources have clarity on metrics. So it's an acronym to say metrics, the economic buyer, the decision criteria, the decision process, the identified pain, the implementation plan, and the champion. At Stripe, we've added the extra I deliberately because, without a successful implementation plan, users don't adopt our products and basically we don't make any revenue. The same goes for how we define our ideal customer profile, success metrics, and how we think about the acquisition, expansion, retention flywheel. That's kind of where I'd say like the standardization ends, right? Like it sits at the top of the funnel. During the awareness stage, you can run a largely consistent motion. However, as you move into the consideration and decision stage of the buyer's journey, localization becomes non-negotiable. So going back to your questions, when we think about customer stories and how to weave them into the sales process, we can't be talking about brands from the US or Europe, even though they might be globally recognizable, because they won't necessarily resonate locally. So you have to think about using customer stories and featuring brands that people will recognize. The second thing is, the pace of the conversation needs to match the culture as well. Channel mix is a significant lever too. What works in Australia and New Zealand doesn't translate to India or Thailand, without real adjustments. So going back to Vietnam, as I said earlier, unless you're on the ground with a lot of Vietnamese speaking reps, you have to be really reliant on sophisticated channel motion that can introduce you to these customers and that can help you bridge that gap. Same with, kind of like the language that you speak and the pace at which you run your sales cycle. All of that needs to be tweaked to ensure that it is reflecting how people like to be sold to and how people like to be engaged in those different markets. So the mental model is this, right? So standardize your frameworks and your metrics and localize the human elements, because the further down the funnel you go, the more localization there needs to be.
Interesting. And do you see any like common traps that people fall into when they do try and go after multi-country GTM throughout Asia?
Yeah, for sure. Look, the biggest trap that I see that businesses and people fall into is mistaking a region like, Asia, Southeast Asia for a monolith. Looking at it like a single geography with a single buyer and a single competitive landscape and a single way of making decisions is a massive mistake. Because even though it might be sitting under one reporting line, it's a collection of really distinct markets that act differently. And when people fall into that trap really compounds on itself. When you treat it as one market, you end up with a motion that's too generic to resonate anywhere. Your messaging doesn't land. Your channel mix is a compromise, and your sales team is trying to run the same play in Singapore, Indonesia, Thailand, wondering why conversion looks so different across each region. I mean, we all know the cautionary tale of Starbucks in Australia, right? It's like such a perfect example of this trap at scale. Starbucks entered Australia in 2000, opened like 80 plus stores within a decade, accumulated over like 100 million, dollars in losses, and was forced to close nearly two-thirds of its store in 2008. The core mistake that they had made, and I think it's such a good case study that, hopefully businesses have learned from, is that they assumed their American model would simply roll out into a different environment. But little did they know, Australia had a deeply sophisticated espresso-led coffee culture built on local cafes, baristas, and independent personal relationships. And Starbucks walked in with a standardized go-to sugary drink menu and assumed that just the logo and the brand name would carry them to a win, and it didn't pay off. So the lesson for all of us go-to-market leaders is the same. The motion that works brilliantly in one market can fall completely flat in another, not because the product is wrong, but it's because the assumptions were never stress tested against a local reality. And that's where, the rubber actually hits the road.
Such good insight. And you're operating now across SMB, startups, mid-market, three different segments. How do you segment across those different size businesses? And, what are the actual cut lines that you guys use? And how do you kind of change your approach depending on whether you're going after, startups, SMB, or mid-market?
Yeah, for sure. Let's start with how we've seen effective segmentation work, right? And this is from my time working across Meltwater, HubSpot, and Stripe. There's two factors, and this one of the factors is more important for us at Stripe. The first one is the firmographics, right? To keep things simple, it's mainly employee size and revenue. Helps you distinguish between what is an SMB, what is a mid-market, what is a enterprise, and so on. But the second factor that's quite important for us here is, digital nativeness of a company. If it's a digital first business, similar size, there's two businesses, one is a digital first business and one is not. That's the categorization we use to distinguish a startup from an SMB. But how you approach these segments differs greatly, because a startup isn't just a small company. It's a company with a fundamentally different relationship to risk, speed, and decision making. They don't purely just consider price. They tend to put an outsized impact on what will help them accelerate their scale and provide their customers with a world-class experience. They'll make purchasing decision in a week that a mid-market company would spend a quarter just evaluating. And so the go-to-market motion has to match that. Low friction, product anchored where possible, with a focus on getting them to value as quickly as possible. SMB sits in an interesting middle ground. The deals are often transactional in size, but the buyers want to feel like they're getting a considered consultative experience. And as someone who cut their teeth at HubSpot and now manages this segment at Stripe, I will advise all go-to-market leaders this. Don't fall into the trap of underinvesting, in this motion, because on the surface, the annual contract value looks small. The volume and the compounding retention value of this segment is where the real opportunity sits. And finally, mid-market or commercial is where the motion shifts significantly. You're now dealing with multiple stakeholders, significantly longer sales cycle, and a buyer who is evaluating you against a more defined set of criteria. The buyer's journey is longer, the funnel requires more nurturing at each stage, and the cultural differences in how consensus is built becomes a significantly bigger factor. So whilst you can use data to create segments, say how you execute on them is what is most important. It's really important for you to think about, how does your buyer make decisions? How quickly? Who's involved? Once you get that right, your sales motion, your channel mix, and eventually your success metrics will follow.
I'd love to transition now to talking about how you approach generating pipeline. If you had to rebuild pipeline from scratch, where are the first three levers or demand levers that you'd pull on, and why?
Yeah. Okay, I've had to do this mental exercise fairly recently, given my new role. So this is this is quite fresh. So I'll give you an overview. So the first one is the existing customers. don't underestimate the power of your existing customers and what they can do in accelerating a flywheel. Social proof, especially if delivered firsthand, can do a 10x better job than your best sales rep can. I've seen this firsthand in terms of how we built an exceptional customer flywheel at HubSpot and the results that it generated. In the startups ecosystem, especially, founders talk to each other. A strong referral from one founder carries more weight than any outbound campaign you could ever run. And in the Southeast Asian market, where trust is a prerequisite for the buyer's journey before even getting started, a warm introduction is worth 10 cold touches. The second is the partner ecosystem, is what I was referring to earlier as well. When done right, partner ecosystem can generate almost as much as revenue as your product and go-to-market teams. I spent 4 years in the channel team at HubSpot. And when I checked in preparation for this chat, the latest information says that 45% of HubSpot's revenue comes from partnerships. Identifying, activating, and nurturing the right partners can create significant compounding returns over time. And the added benefit is that it also localizes naturally as your partners can, to steal a colleague's analogy, act as your arms and legs, which matters enormously when you're operating across different markets as culturally distinct as Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia simultaneously. And the third lever I'd say is outbound. I pulled this one last deliberately, not because it's least important, but because outbound is the most effective when it's informed by what you've already learned from the first two. Your existing customers tell you exactly who your ideal customer profile is. Your ecosystem partner tell you which channel and messages resonate the most. And by the time you're running outbound, you're not just guessing. You have a sharp signal back view on who to target, how to reach them, and what to say. So outbound without that foundation is just really expensive spray and pray.
And you mentioned the third item there around outbound. Keen to understand how Stripe's approaching outbound at the moment with the introduction of AI tools. Are you guys experimenting at the moment with any AI tools to help with your outbound motion? And what does that look like at the moment?
Yeah, for sure. And look, I'll probably say like this is my perspective more than general Stripe perspective, but I'll say that we're quite aligned, right? Because as a business, we're focused on value and having meaningful conversations with our customers, because payments infrastructure is not nice to have, right? It is a need to have. So it is imperative that we treat these conversations with that level of care and seriousness. In my mind, I'd say a good outbound starts with a signal or a trigger event. Especially in the markets and segments that I work in, the biggest differentiator between outbound that works and outbound that doesn't is whether you've done the work to understand what's actually happening in the buyer's world before you reach out. So good outbound means that, you know why you're reaching out to this person at this company right now. Maybe they've just raised the funding round. Maybe they're expanding into a new market. And that is specifically what earns attention, especially in markets where, buyers are skeptical of unsolicited contact, and trust takes a decent amount of time to build. Good outbound also respects the buyer's journey. It should never shortcut straight to the pitch. It might mean, leading with an insight or relevant peer example rather than a product feature. In a startup world, it might mean acknowledging the specific stage that they're at and speaking directly to that pain. On the flip side, however, bad outbound is literally one of those several messages that I get on LinkedIn saying, "Dear Varun, I see you're a leader at HubSpot." I don't read beyond that because I haven't worked there for over 4 years. But that is literally volume attack masquerading as strategy. I'd say that the days of swapping first name and company name and calling it a tailored outreach are done. Buyers see through it immediately. And in markets where your reputation travels fast, bad outbound doesn't just fail. It actually, it actively damages your brand.
So true. I'd love to transition now into talking about expansion and retention, because I know you've got a huge amount of experience here, both at Stripe and also previously at HubSpot, where you led the highest performing CS team during 2020. So keen to understand, what were some of the key strategies that you implemented that drove your team's results?
Yeah, for sure. And look, I kind of touched on it earlier when talking about my inflection point, but a lot of the learning that I took from that year is what laid the foundation for what 2020 looked like, right? And I think it came down to three things. The first is a collective commitment. The second is about process. And the third is the culture that we built along the way. I'd say that it started even before the year kicked off properly. I brought the whole team together for a strategy and planning day to build our mission and vision collectively. So I wanted to make sure that this was not something that I handed down, but something that we built together. And in that room, we shared a commitment. We had missed 2019. There was no other way around it, and we were going to make up for it. We wanted to be the best performing team at HubSpot. So that was, I'd say, like our collective commitment. Mm. And that wasn't just my ambition, right? Everybody owned it. And that shared accountability fundamentally changed how the team showed up to work every day for the rest of the year. From a process standpoint, I mapped out very early where our risk and opportunity sat across the entire customer base. And that gave us clarity on where to channel our energy rather than spreading it thin. I also built dashboards that doubled as accountability tools, not just for me, but for the team. People knew exactly where to focus on without me having to tell them explicitly. And this mattered so much more when you can't just walk over to someone's desk. Because, of course, March came and brought with it the COVID-19 lockdowns, and with it, everything changed overnight. We were remote, our customers were navigating their own uncertainty, and the conversations got really hard. At that point in time, the thing that I kept reinforcing with the team was the distinction between empathy and sympathy, because sympathy can cloud your judgment and lead to burnout when you're having some of these difficult conversations with scared customers who are facing their own uncertainty week after week. Empathy, on the other hand, meant that you're genuinely trying to understand what the customer is experiencing and thinking critically about how to help. And, that's what keeps you sharp and keeps you useful to them. In fact, I've wrote my first, and, I definitely think is the only LinkedIn article I wrote on how to navigate COVID-19 as a CSM, hoping that it could help others who were kind of going through those uncertain times. And through it all, I made it a point of celebrating every single win and shining a spotlight on people going above and beyond. I talked about this earlier as well about elevating people on my team. So what happened organically from that was, something that I'm genuinely really proud of, right? Different people on the team, stepped up as leaders in their own right. Like I said, they were domain experts, but they also took it upon themselves to step up as leaders. So that ensured that, the engine wasn't running on like a single managerial cylinder. That distribution leadership is what gave us real resilience through you know, thinking back, like an incredibly unpredictable year. And honestly, I feel like that is what turned us from a good team to a great one. Now, all of that collectively also fed the competitive streak. Every month, I was tracking how we were sitting relative to other teams globally. And by mid-year, we kind of knew who we were competing with for that top spot. But what I loved especially was that by that point in time, the team, if I would forget, because we were super busy and we were just kind of going through all of this change, they would proactively ask me what our position was at the end of each month. And that's when I knew, that the culture had really taken over. And yes, it was great to get the top spot for the year, but I would have been extremely happy, and I'm still proud, even if we hadn't, because what we had set out to do was, move from being a collection of individual contributors to a team. And I think we had done that successfully.
Yeah, I love it. And I love how you made culture the cornerstone of the reason for that success. And, even to the point of making little micro missions within the company mission to help fuel your team to succeed. Really cool. And I want to talk as well about product adoption and time to value is such a key driver in both customer retention, but also when it fails, it's big reason for churn. What's your approach to driving product adoption and time to value, and where do you see most teams bottleneck themselves?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? And my entire approach to time to value starts with one question. What does value actually mean to this customer? Because if you haven't aligned on that up front, you can execute a flawless onboarding and still lose the customer because you weren't, you're working towards the wrong outcome. I know this sounds obvious, but I've seen so many teams skip it. They move fast into product setup and adoption activities because that kind of feels like progress. But, but speed without direction isn't time to value. It's basically just checking a box. So the first thing I do is slow down the conversation just enough to get genuine alignment on what success looks like for this specific customer, not a health score, not a not a product usage metric, because we care about that. The customer doesn't. We want to understand what is the business outcome that came to us for, and how will they know that they've achieved it. Using the SMART goal framework, which is defining the goal to make sure that it's specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely or time bound, is very effective at helping guide this conversation. Once you've done that, everything else, onboarding, adoption milestones, check-in cadences, It's got a North Star oriented to it. And the biggest bottleneck that I've seen teams hit is not defining that success metric early enough. If you wait until the renewal conversations, and we've all been kind of guilty of doing that at some point in our career, you're already too late. Those metrics need to be established at the start and revisited regularly, not as a checkbox, but a genuine ongoing conversation. And of course, if the customer hits the goal, it is important to recalibrate and figure out, okay, what is the next goal? How are we going to work towards it? Who's responsible for what? And by when we're going to get to it.
Gotcha. And would you say this approach is more reserved for your mid-touch, high-touch accounts, or did you extend it as well to those low-touch and tech-touch accounts as well?
Yeah, I'd say that it was important for any business that had some sort of a human interaction, we would do it. Right. So I'd say for some of the self-serve businesses where that was like at the really long tail, where we hadn't we were looking at that point in time early on at HubSpot, especially to figure out how can we productize some of these goals so that way we could do some sort of product-led engagements. But any customer that had received some sort of human onboarding or that had a sales process involved in bringing them on board, we made sure that, those smart goals were covered. But to your question, I will encourage, every single business to define, if it's going to be tech touch or product led, asking these questions upfront is fantastic, right? Like, hey, what brings you to us? How are you going to define, what are your core goals? What does success look like in 12 months? Now, with a lot of these AI tools, we can essentially automate some of that, right? Like you can track product usage and see like, are they tracking to the goals? If not, then can we find a way to intervene and bring them back on track?
Sure. And a lot of what they share in that moment can often be something internal on their end. So it might be, the reason why I came to you is because I want to drive more sales or more efficiency in this area. And it might not necessarily be a metric that you're able to capture within your platform. How do you go about it with your teams to capture progress towards that success metric? Is it something that is done through just conversations with the customers at certain checkpoints and more of a qualitative discussion? Or is there other methods that you guys do to approach it?
Yeah. And look, that's kind of where we need to really overlay both data and context, right? Because data without context sometimes doesn't give us a true picture. In my mind, if an account is associated with a person internally in any organization, the account manager or the CSM at some point should be having the conversation with the customer to try and understand what do they care about and how they're going to measure. Obviously, I've had the luxury of working in a CRM company and now in a financial infrastructure company where we can very easily quantify some of these goals, right? If you want to drive more sales, you want to drive more pipeline, you want to drive more revenue, we've got access to that data and we should very easily be able to tell people if they're on track to smash it, they're on track to just hit it, or if they're going to miss it. And all of that should help inform how people have these conversations with the customers. Now, this is just my take and my opinion, but if you are working in an industry where it's perhaps not so easily quantifiable, think about what is the need that they've come to your business for. Right. And every product and every organization has a need that we solve for their ideal buyer persona. We need to think about how can we quantify what success looks like where if that need is effectively met or solved. And I think, creating a process to track that and productizing that tracking is the business's responsibility. And then it is the account manager or the CSM's responsibility to speak to the customer, understand if the goals have changed, bring them back on track and provide them with that ongoing consultation and that ongoing advice to keep making adjustments as needed.
What about when it comes to expansion? Like, are there certain key signals that you tend to monitor to identify whether an account is right for expansion?
Yeah. Look, I think the mistake that most teams make with expansion is like they wait for a revenue signal, right? The customer is asking about pricing or they're asking about a particular product or when the renewal comes up. Yes, there's like a natural upsell conversation there. But at that point, you're not predicting expansion. You're just processing it. You're just reacting to it. The teams that consistently outperform on expansion are reading the signal that show up weeks or months earlier. And going back to what I talk about, this is really where the combination of data and context, comes into play. So let's just say, the system is doing the heavy lifting of pointing people in the right direction. Let's say you've set things up and you've got the data-driven signals that lets AEs or account managers or customer success managers know that, hey, based on what we've identified as like a revenue signal, your customer is essentially indicating them, reach out to them proactively. Let's just say you've set all of that up. Once that data surfaces the right signal to the right person at the right time, it is now their job to overlay the context, validate that opportunity, and move quickly. I'd say, like, that combination of system intelligence and human judgment is really what makes expansion motion scalable. And this matters because some of the most valuable expansion signals never show up cleanly in data, like until it's too late, right? I talked about that earlier as well, where the data without the context is really like a couple of question marks and missing a couple of pieces. Let's just say a customer is looking to expand internationally or launch a new product line. Those intentions don't show up in data until it's too late. Those intentions live in conversations and relationships. So it's important to have some of those conversations, whether that be QBR or goal setting, to try and understand, what are you working on? What do the next 12 months look like for you? What are some of the blockers you see that you're trying to address? So that way, if you've had those conversations, you can act immediately and not wait for, some of those lagging signals that come down the line. I think on the relationship side, the most reliable indicator that I found is, champion behavior. When your key contact starts pulling in stakeholders, introducing you to their CFO, looping in different business units, asking questions that go beyond the immediate use case, that's a fantastic signal that value is being established and they're doing some internal selling on your behalf. And that behavior, when that usually happens, always precedes an expansion conversation. Similarly, when a customer reaches out to you proactively, not just because something is broken, but because they want to explore something new, that is once again the shift that is a bit of like a pull factor from the reactive to proactive engagement that tells you a lot about how they're owning the thinking. And going back to the data side, I'll definitely encourage businesses to, watch usage very, very closely. It's not just about whether they're logging in. Are they going deep into the product? Are they adopting certain features that they previously didn't sign up to? Because those are, once again, the push signals that I referred to that point to you as a business that, hey, this business, this particular customer is ready for a little bit more expansion. And I'd say the last signal is external, right? What's happening in their business? Are they hiring? Are they raising funding? Are they expanding into new markets? Because budget cycle and business growth triggers are often the most underutilized leading indicators because they require your team to pay attention to what's happening outside of the product, not just inside of it. But in my experience, a startup that just raised a Series B or an SMB that's expanding regionally is almost an expansion opportunity waiting to happen. So going back to the question, the real skill is in combining all of that. One signal can be a little misleading, perhaps not give you the full picture. But if you see a champion putting in new stakeholders, they're also increasing usage and a funding announcement happens in that same window, that's when you've kind of hit that holy trifecta.
Yeah. And how do you approach it when it comes to, say, like an SMB account who might be more, say, a bricks and mortar business where the traditional signals of, funding round or grew into a new region might not be available? How do you approach looking out for signals to indicate that there's an expansion opportunities on those?
Yeah, good question. So if you were to just bring it down to the example that you share with bricks and mortar, are they setting up new branches? Have they expanded their product lines? Um, were they previously offering 5 and now are they offering 7? All of those are probably like, early signals that help you determine that an SMB business is also thinking about expansion. Of course, it plays out very, very differently, but you can have, similar conversations as you think about, hey, what are your revenue goals for this year? How much are you looking to increase your revenue by? And if someone says, hey, I want to grow my revenue by 30% this year, a great follow-up question to ask there is, fantastic. How do you intend on generating 30% additional revenue? What are you planning on doing? And the responses to that question sometimes is what, is where the goal sits. They could say, oh, we're planning on investing a little bit more in marketing. Oh, we're actually launching a new proprietary product that's going to separate us from everyone else. Or we're expanding into another country or another state, or we're setting up new branches. So I'd say, having that goal-oriented conversation and trying to understand how businesses intend on getting to those goals is very important.
Yeah, fantastic. And last question on our discussion on retention, and it's our favorite topic, churn. How do you approach reducing churn, especially when it's based on factors outside your team's control, but may be within their influence?
Yeah, for sure. Look, at dealing with what we can and can't control, I always lean on the circles of control as a framework. And I coincidentally addressed this very recently with my team. For those who may not be familiar with this, it's a cognitive tool for reducing anxiety and enhancing efficacy by focusing the energy solely on aspects within one's direct control, such as attitudes, behavior, and reaction. It consists of three concentric circles. So the first one is the circle of control, which is the inner circle, which is aspect entirely within your power, including actions, word, attitude, and personal goals. Second is circle of influence, which is the middle circle, which is elements you can affect but not directly control, such as, your colleague's opinion or the behavior of others or certain external relationships. And finally, it's the circle of concern, which is the outermost circle, things you worry about greatly, but you cannot change, such as the weather, the past, or global events. The mistake that most people make is spending a ton of emotional and strategic energy on the outer ring. Factors, those outside factors hit hard and they hit fast almost anywhere. A macroeconomic downturn can tighten budgets overnight. A founder exit can unravel a relationship that you've spent years building. However, these are outside of your control. What teams should be doing is being ruthlessly focused on the two middle rings. What intentional action can you take daily? Do you know what your customers really care about? Have you quantified their goals? Are you speaking to the right people? How frequently are you talking to them? And in practice, it comes down to three things for me. The first one is ROI visibility, because when budget cuts come and in a macro downturn, they always come. The question that every decision maker is asking is, what or who do I cut first? You want to be the last on that list. And the only way to guarantee that outcome is to make sure that the value you're delivering is visible, quantified, and connected to the outcomes that a business genuinely cares about. Not just usage metrics, because it's a bit vanity for a business outcomes, right? Because when a CFO is looking at the budget with a red pen to cross, they need to see a number next to your name that makes cutting you feel really painful. The second is stakeholder depth. If your entire relationship sits with one person, whether that be one founder, one champion, or one budget holder, you're essentially one resignation away from starting over. But multiple meaningful relationships across that account isn't just good account management. It's almost like, risk management. And the third, and very important in my mind, is how you're positioned in the customer's mind. If you're a vendor, you're a line item. However, if you're someone who understands their business, challenges their thinking, and is genuinely invested in their success, you become a strategic partner. And strategic partnerships survive budget cuts and leadership changes far more often than contracts do. So when churn comes from factors outside of my control, I don't panic about the things that I can't change. What I do is I ask myself, did we do everything within our control and influence to make ourselves indispensable before this happened? And if the answer to that question is yes, I can go to sleep peacefully at night. But I also know this. If we've done the right things and that are within our control and influence, churn doesn't just happen. So it's more often that misalignment with the value, stakeholders, and the relationship dynamic. When that's not done correctly, that's when churn happens.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice. And you mentioned there around trying to build value in the customer or the customer's view of value of your product. How do you navigate the challenge of doing this when, say, you're got the responsibility of trying to do this with like an SMB account that might not have the the same buy-in at a certain point in that customer journey, and your say CSM is struggling to get in conversations with them? How do you try to navigate those?
Yeah, and look, that's a good one, right? And the reality is that happens sometimes. So the important thing here is to understand that the definition of value is not the same everywhere. Going back to what I talked about when defining startups, SMB, and mid-market, how success is defined differs greatly. Now, let's just go back to SMBs, right? How one SMB owner defines value and success can be chalk and cheese compared to another SMB owner. So it is very important once again. And that's where I'd say like the relationship really matters, right? Like, have you taken the time to ask those questions around how will you define success, right? Like let's just say when you're doing the sale, you're running the acquisition, it is important to understand, okay, if we're having a conversation 12 months down the line, what do you need to see that will let us know that, or let you know rather, let both of us know that your investment has delivered a quantifiable return for you. And ideally that return is 2x or 3x. How are you going to define that? And which is why, like I said, churn doesn't happen at the point of renewal. If things aren't done right at the point of sale, at the point of onboarding, at the multiple points of check-in, they're all essentially building up towards that churn. So it is very important to understand who are you talking to? Really dig into the buyer persona. I'll kind of keep taking it back to that, right? Because different buyer personas care about different things. And it is very important that you know not just the business, but the person behind the business and what they care about, how they're going to measure success. What are they concerned about as well? Right. I think understanding the concern for that person is also really good because quite often businesses and people, in fact, make fear-based decisions. And if you understand what are the different factors that concern them, you can, in some degree, preempt it and mitigate some of that too.
Yeah, so true, so true. Now, we can't have a conversation without talking about AI. I'm keen to hear your view on the whole AI topic at the moment, which is everywhere. And, how are you guys leveraging AI within Stripe at the moment? You guys started experimenting, building out AI agents with Claude Code or implementing third-party agents or building your own?
Yeah. And look, it's a good question. And I did see a LinkedIn post this morning as well, which kind of talks a little about a tool that I'm going to touch on this morning. I want to honor this really honestly, right? I want to be super honest as I answer this question because I think there's so much going on in the market right now about AI and go to market. I'd say a lot of organizations are in different stages of adopting and implementing AI. So let me tell you where we're actually at and what's working and where we're kind of headed. The most tangible thing we've implemented right now that's being used widely is Gemini, especially to automate that initial account research for our AEs. In my segment, which is the startup, SMB, and mid-market, the portfolio is large, right? And the expectation that an AE can walk into every conversation fully briefed on a customer's business, their recent news, their growth signals is unrealistic if you're doing it manually, right? But AI has changed that. AEs can now show up to conversations with a level of account context that would have taken significantly longer to pull together previously. And I'd say that directly improves the quality of outreach and the conversation, which flows through pipeline. If you give, we've given, created certain prompts for Gemini that does a lot of this account research, and all an AE has to do is upload their territory and it tells them exactly who's what and so on. And we've also got these account insights embedded into our Salesforce. The second one is Gong. I know you just said Claude Code killed Gong, but I think it'll be a while before, that does happen. For those of you, for your listeners who may not be familiar with Gong, it's a conversational intelligence tool, and we're using it to streamline a lot of the administrative tasks as well. But I'll be really transparent, right? All of this is still work in progress. In my opinion, I don't think any GTM leader has fully cracked it. If they do, please let me know who they are, because I'd love to pick their brain on, how they're doing things and, what gives them so much confidence that they've cracked it. And I think the honest answer to what's changed is that, AI hasn't transformed go-to-market yet, in my opinion, but it's giving back a ton of time to people, who need it the most. It's also improving the quality of inputs at the top of that funnel. And the teams that build discipline in how well they use it, they'll be able to build that competitive advantage that, will compound over time. Going back to the agent stuff, I've actually just gotten access to Cursor and Claude Code as of Friday last week, but I haven't had a chance to get stuck into that just yet. But what I'm really excited about is figuring out how can I automate more of the execution layer, both for myself and the team. Forecasting in particular, is an area where I think there's a ton of opportunity to better service signals faster and reduce some manual overhead that currently sits both on myself and the AEs. So maybe in a couple of weeks, I can give you a response to what sort of agents out there.
It's interesting. Claude Code, it's like getting sucked into the vortex. So I'm keen to hear how you go once you get started. It's a little bit addictive once you get started building things out and realizing you feel like a software engineer and all of those ideas you have caught in your head, you all of a sudden you can start building.
Yeah.
It's been interesting because I've been experimenting with Claude Code, and it's interesting when like within go-to-market teams, there's a lot of ideas we have and things that would help our workflows, but often the biggest roadblock is trying to get engineering support to build anything for us. And it never gets prioritized because it's not to do with our core product. And so it always gets put on the back burner. So you're reliant on either third-party tools, but there's often either a cost barrier there or those third-party tools don't quite do exactly what you want. But it's interesting now with Claude Code and similar platforms, leaders like ourselves can basically be able to jump in, brain dump exactly like what we're hoping to create, connect it to the data that we need it to, and then it can pretty much go and build some of these tools. Now, I don't think it's going to necessarily be the best use of time, money, and resources to build anything super powerful ourselves, but all those little kind of small little point solutions that can help our teams, I think it's going to be a real game changer for a lot of teams who are adopting this as part of their workflow.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on that one, mate. But I will, agree to, with you as well. There's so much noise now, in particular on LinkedIn about, Cloud Code just killed the CRM. It did this and it did that. You can vibe code a CRM in 12
Good clickbait.
Fantastic clickbait, right? And it's just like, hey, if you want to know what I did, comment, build, and I'll send you my prompt. And I'm like, people have figured out LinkedIn engineering and what they need to do to drive their own brand across LinkedIn. But what I saw was that Lovable uses HubSpot. It's as simple as that. So something that Lovable, which is at the forefront of vibe coding, they're using, a CRM. So cautionary tale to all the really aspiring builders, and especially if you're in a scaling business, is that really figuring out, what is core infrastructure. I'd say let the experts kind of do that. And then you can vibe code and use tools like Cloud Code to build everything around it to make your life easier.
Yeah, I'll look out for any posts around Claude Code just killed Stripe or yeah. Good luck to them. Yeah. Awesome. Well, final question. I asked this to all my guests. If you could add one page to the GTM playbook, what would it be and why?
Yeah. Look, if I could add one page to the GTM playbook, it would be this: hire for resilience and coachability before you hire for experience. And if my first manager, Victor Nick, hadn't done this, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So to elaborate, resilience: can this person absorb a setback and keep moving without it derailing them? In sales, especially in the markets that I operate in, things go wrong all the time. Deals fall over, strategies need to pivot, markets don't behave in the way that you model. The people who thrive are the ones who can take a hit and come back with a clear head. And the second is coachability, not just willingness to receive feedback, but a genuine hunger to get better, because the best organizational environments are learning environments. And if someone is defensive about their gaps or too anchored on how they've done things, no amount of experience can make up for that. The hiring bar that I now hold myself to is three things in one. I want someone who can do the job effectively today. That's obviously a non-negotiable. I want somebody who will do the job exceptionally down the line as they grow into the role and the context around them evolves. And finally, I want someone who is a culture add. So going back to about Chad, the center of all of that, I want somebody who's a culture add and not just a culture fit, because I want to make sure that they don't just slot in to the team, but they elevate the team, right? So somebody who comes in and raises the standard of the people around them, brings to the team something that the team didn't have before. And collectively, we all just get elevated. Because in my mind, I'd say a hire that ticks all of those three boxes doesn't just fill a seat. Their impact compounds over time. And in a high growth, multi-model go-to-market environment, the quality of people you surround yourself with is ultimately the most important decision that you can make.
Couldn't agree more. And keen to hear from you then. What interview questions do you then ask to really extract and identify if they've got that resilience and that coachability?
Yeah. So this was like a while ago. This was my first question back at HubSpot. I don't ask this anymore. I'll talk you through what some of the questions I ask now. The first one that I did ask back then was, I'd say, look, you're obviously, very well experienced, really intelligent, but the team that you're going to come and join is a team of absolute superstars. How will you feel about joining the team and being the dumbest person on the team? It's very pointed and it's a bit blunt, but it immediately would separate people who maybe pretended like they were coachable and humble, but did not. Because if that question kind of shook people a little bit and kind of, rattled their ego, that gave me a bit of a red flag that maybe when things does get difficult and I have to have a difficult conversation with them, they may not approach things with the right headspace. Whereas people who would just be like, that's exactly what I want. That is what I'm seeking. And that's what excites me. That is a massive, green flag. Whereas now, and this is probably if somebody who's going to interview for Stripe is getting a little bit of a peek behind the scenes, we question more about, the question that I ask is, talk me through, the last time you failed. Why did you fail? What did you learn from it? Was there a customer relationship that did not go to plan? Why did it not go to plan? And what did you do to try and fix it? What was the last piece of difficult feedback that you got from a peer or your customer or your manager? And what was it? How have you improved off the back of that? So I'm really testing for all of that, like, failure. How do they react to difficult conversations? How do they react to coaching conversations? Because I do believe the responses to those questions tells a lot about who they are, especially if when presented those questions, did they genuinely demonstrate humility? Did they tell you for what it was and what it is versus making it seem like, yeah, look, yes, I failed, but it wasn't my fault. Because I've seen some people do that, like immediately try and play the blame game. Even when, asked the question like this, that for me is once again a bit of an orange flag, right? But if somebody takes responsibility for their failure and owns it and talks about what they've learned and how they've improved, like that is the ultimate green flag for me.
So good, so good. Well, Varun, thank you so much for jumping on the podcast today and sharing such amazing insight across your journey and career. Now, if anyone who's listening wants to connect with you, what's the best way to go about it?
Yeah, I'd probably say get me on LinkedIn, Varun Bhandarkar. You can find me on LinkedIn. Should be just one Varun Bhandarkar if you look for me working at Stripe.
So, well, thanks again, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks, Mark.